before, they had met in the street, but Raskolnikov had turned away and even crossed to the other side, that he might not be observed. And though Razumihin noticed him, he passed him by, as he did not want to annoy him. Chapter 5. Of course. I've been meaning lately to go to Razumihin's to ask for work, to ask him to get me lessons or something, Raskolnikov thought. But what help can he be to me now? Suppose farthing with me, if he has any farthings, so that I could get some boots and make myself tidy enough to give lessons. Well. And what then? What shall I do with the few coppers I earn? That's not what I want now. It's really absurd for me to go to Razumihin. The question why he was going to Razumihin agitated him even more than he was himself aware. He kept uneasily seeking for some sinister significance in this apparently ordinary action. Could I have expected to set it all straight and to find a way out by means of Razumihin alone? He asked himself in perplexity. He pondered and rubbed his forehead, and, strange to say, after long musing, suddenly, as if it were spontaneously and by chance, a fantastic thought came into his head. To Razumihin's, he said all at once, calmly as though he had reached a final determination. I shall go to Razumihin's, of course, but not now. I shall go to him on the next day after it, when it will all be over and everything will begin afresh. And suddenly, he realized what he was thinking. After it? He shouted, jumping up for the seat. But is it really going to happen? Is it possible it really will happen? He left the seat and went off almost at a run. He meant to turn back, homewards, but the thought of going home suddenly filled him with intense loathing. In that hole, in that awful little cupboard of his, all this had for a past month been growing up in him, and he walked on at random. His nervous shudder had passed into a fever that made him feel shivering. In spite of the heat, he felt cold. With a kind of effort, he began almost unconsciously, from some inner craving, to stare at all the objects before him, as though looking for something to distract his attention. But he did not succeed, and kept dropping every moment into brooding. When with a start he lifted his head again and looked around, he forgot at once what he had just been thinking about, and even where he was going. In this way, he walked right across Vasilievsky Ostrov, came out onto the Lesser Neva, crossed the bridge, and turned towards the islands. The greenness and the freshness were at first restful to his weary eyes after the dust of the town and the huge houses that hemmed him in and weighed upon him. Here, there were no taverns, no stifling closeness, no stench. But soon these new pleasant sensations passed into morbid irritability. Sometimes he stood still before a brightly painted summer villa, standing among green foliage. He gazed through the fence. He saw in the distance smartly dressed women on the verandas and balconies, and children running in the gardens. The flowers especially caught his attention. He gazed at them longer than at anything. He was met, too, by luxurious carriages and by men and women on horseback. He watched them with curious eyes, and forgot about them before they had vanished from his sight. Once, he stood still and counted his money. He found he had 30 kopecks. 20 to the policeman, 3 to Nastasia for the letter, so I must have given 47 or 50 to the Marmeladovs yesterday, he thought, reckoning it up for some unknown reason. But he soon forgot with what object he had taken the money out of his pocket. He recalled it on passing an eating house or tavern and felt that he was hungry. Going into the tavern, he drank a glass of vodka and ate a pie of some sort. He finished eating it as he walked away. It was a long while since he had taken vodka, and it had an effect upon him at once, though he had only drank a wineglassful. His legs felt suddenly heavy, and a great drowsiness came upon him. He turned homewards, but reaching Petrovsky Ostrov, he stopped completely exhausted, turned off the road into the bushes, sank down upon the grass, and instantly fell asleep. In a morbid condition of the brain, dreams often have a singular actuality, vividness, and extraordinary semblance of reality. At times, monstrous images are created, But the setting and the whole picture are so truth-like and filled with details so delicate, so unexpectedly, but so artistically consistent, that the dreamer, were he an artist like Pushkin or Turgenev even, could never have invented them in the waking state. Such sick dreams always remain long in the memory, and make a powerful impression on the overwrought and deranged nervous system. Raskolnikov had a fearful dream. He dreamt he was back in his childhood, in the little town of his birth. He was a child, about 7 years old, walking into the country with his father on the evening of a holiday. It was a grey and heavy day. The country was exactly as he remembered it. Indeed, he recalled it far more vividly in his dream than he had done in his memory. The little town stood on a level flat, as bare as the hand, not even a willow near it. Only in the far distance, a copse lay, a dark blur on the very edge, and stood a tavern, a big tavern, which had always aroused in him a feeling of aversion, even of fear, when he walked by it with his father. There was always a crowd there, always shouting, laughter and abuse, hideous hoarse singing and often fighting. Drunken and horrible-looking figures were hanging about the tavern. He used to cling close to his father, trembling all over when he met them. Near the tavern, the road became a dusty track, the dust of which was always black. It was a winding road, and about 100 paces further on, it turned to the right to the graveyard. In the middle of the graveyard stood a stone church with a green cupola, where he used to go to Mass 2 or 3 times a year with his father and mother, when a service was held in memory of his grandmother, who had long been dead and whom he had never seen. On these occasions, they used to take on a white dish, tied up in a table napkin, a special sort of rice pudding with raisins stuck in it in the shape of a cross. He loved that church, the old-fashioned, unadorned icons, and the old priest with the shaking head. Near his grandmother's grave, which was marked by a stone, was the little grave of his younger brother, who had died at 6 months old. He did not remember him at all, but he had been told about his little brother, and whenever he visited the graveyard, he used religiously and reverently to cross himself and to bow down and kiss the little grave. And now he dreamt that he was walking with his father past the tavern on the way to the graveyard. He was holding his father's hand and looking with dread at the tavern. A peculiar circumstance attracted his attention. There seemed to be some kind of festivity going on. There were crowds of gaily dressed townspeople, peasant women, their husbands, and riffraff of all sorts, all singing and all more or less drunk. Near the entrance of the tavern stood a cart, but a strange cart. It was one of those big carts, usually drawn by heavy cart horses and laden with casks of wine or other heavy goods. He always liked looking at those great cart horses, with their long manes, thick legs and slow, even pace, drawing along a perfect mountain with no appearance of effort, as though it was easier going with a load than without it. But now, strange to say, in the shafts of such a cart, he saw a thin little sorrel beast, one of those peasants' nags, which he had often seen straining their utmost under a heavy load of wood or hay, especially when the wheels were stuck in the mud or in a rut. And the peasants would beat them so cruelly, sometimes even about the nose and eyes, and he felt so sorry for them that he almost cried, and his mother always used to take him away from the window. All of a sudden, there was a great uproar of shouting, singing, and the balalaika, and from the tavern, a number of big and very drunken peasants came out, wearing red and blue shirts and coats thrown over their shoulders. "Get in! Get in!" shouted one of them, a young, thick-necked peasant with a fleshy face red as a carrot. "I'll take you all, get in!" But at once there was an outbreak of laughter and exclamations in the crowd. "Take a soul with a beast like that? Why, Milkolka, you are crazy to put an egg like that in such a cart. And this mare is 20 if she's a day, mates." "Get in, I'll take you all," Milkolka shouted again, leaping first into the cart, seizing the reins and standing straight up in front. "The bay has gone with Matvey," he shouted from the cart. "And this brute, mates, is just breaking my heart. I feel as if I could kill her. She's just eating her head off. Get in, I tell you. I'll make her gallop. She'll gallop." And he picked up the whip preparing himself with relish to flog the little mare. "Get in, come along." The crowd laughed. "Do you hear she'll gallop?" "Gallop indeed. She's not had a gallop in her for the last 10 years. She'll jog along." "Don't mind her, mates. Bring a whip for each of you, get ready." "All right, give it to her." They all clambered into Mielkolka's cart, laughing and making jokes. 6 men got in, and there was still room for more. They hauled in a fat, rosy-cheeked woman. She was dressed in red cotton, in a pointed, beaded headdress and thick leather shoes. She was cracking nuts and laughing. The crowd round them was laughing too, and indeed, how could they help laughing? That wretched nag was to drag all the cartload of them at a gallop. 2 young fellows in the cart were just getting whips ready to help Mielkolka. With the cry of "now," the mare tugged with all her might, but far from galloping, could scarcely move forward. She struggled with her legs, gasping and shrinking from the blows of the 3 whips which were showered upon her like hail. The laughter in the cart and in the crowd was redoubled, but Mielkolka flew into a rage and furiously thrashed the mare, as though he supposed she really could gallop. "Let me in too, mates," shouted a young man in the crowd whose appetite was aroused. "Get in, all get in," cried Mielkolka. "She will draw you all. I'll beat her to death." And he thrashed and thrashed at the mare, beside himself with fury. "Father, Father," he cried. "Father, what are they doing? Father, they're beating the poor horse." Come along," said his father. "They are drunken and foolish. They are in fun. Come away, don't look." And he tried to draw him away, but he tore himself away from his hand and, beside himself with horror, ran to the horse. The poor beast was in a bad way. She was gasping, standing still, then tugging again, and almost falling. "Beat her to death," cried Mielkolka. "It's come to that. I'll do for her." "What are you about? Are you Christian, you devil?" shouted an old man in the crowd. "Did anyone ever see the like? A wretched nag like that pulling such a cartload?" said another. "You'll kill her," shouted the third. "Don't meddle, it's my property. I'll do what I choose. Get in, more of you. Get in, all of you. I will have a go at a gallop." All at once, laughter broke into a roar and covered everything. The mare, roused by the shower of blows, began feebly kicking. Even the old man could not help smiling. To think of a wretched little beast like that trying to kick. 2 lads in the crowd snatched up whips and ran to the mare to beat her about the ribs. 1 ran each side. "Hit her in the face! In the eyes! In the eyes!" cried Mielkolka. "Give us a song, mates!" shouted someone in the cart, and everyone in the cart joined in a riotous song, jingling a tambourine and whistling. The woman went on cracking nuts and laughing. He ran beside the mare, ran in front of her, saw her being whipped across the eyes, right in the eyes. He was crying. He felt choking. His tears were streaming. One of the men gave him a cut with the whip across the face. He did not feel it. Wringing his hands and screaming, he rushed up to the grey-haired old man with the grey beard who was shaking his head in disapproval. One woman seized him by the hand and would have taken him away, but he tore himself from her and ran back to the mare. She was almost at the last gasp, but began kicking once more. "I'll teach you to kick," Mielkolka shouted ferociously. He threw down the whip, bent forward, and picked up from the bottom of the cart a long, thick shaft. He took hold of one end with both hands and, with an effort, brandished it over the mare. "He'll crush her," was shouted round him. "He'll kill her." "It's my property," shouted Mielkolka, and brought the shaft down with a swinging blow. There was a sound of a heavy thud. "Thrash her! Thrash her! Why have you stopped?" shouted voices in the crowd. And Mielkolka swung the shaft a second time, and it fell a second time on the spine of the luckless mare. She sank back on her haunches, but lurched forward and tugged forward with all her force, tugged first on one side and then the other, trying to move the cart. But the 6 whips were attacking her in all directions, and the shaft was raised again and fell upon her a third time, then a fourth, with heavy measured blows. Mielkolka was in a fury that he could not kill her at one blow. "She's a tough one," was shouted in the crowd. "She'll fall in a minute, mates," There will soon be an end of her, said an admiring spectator in the crowd. Fetch an axe to her, finish her off, shouted a third. I'll show you, send off! Mielkolka screamed frantically. He threw down the shaft, stooped down in the cart, and picked up an iron crowbar. Look out! He shouted, and with all his might, he dealt a stunning blow at the poor mare. The blow fell, the mare staggered, sank back, tried to pull, but the bar fell again with a swinging blow on her back, and she fell on the ground like a log. Finish her off! Shouted Mielkolka, and he leapt beside himself, out of the cart. Several young men, also flushed with drink, seized anything they could come across, whips, sticks, poles, and ran to the dying mare. Mielkolka stood on one side and began dealing random blows with the crowbar. The mare stretched out her head, drew a long breath, and died. You butchered her, someone shouted in the crowd. Why wouldn't she gallop then? My property, shouted Mielkolka, with bloodshot eyes, brandishing the bar in his hands. He stood as though regretting that he had nothing more to beat. No mistake about it, you're not a Christian, many voices were shouting in the crowd. But the poor boy beside himself made his way screaming through the crowd to the sorrel nag, put his arms round her bleeding dead head, and kissed it, kissed the eyes and kissed the lips. Then he jumped up and flew in a frenzy with his little fists out at Mielkolka. At that instant, his father, who had been running after him, snatched him up and carried him out of the crowd. Come along, come, let us go home, he said to him. Father, why did they kill the poor horse? He sobbed, but his voice broke and the words came in shrieks from his panting chest. They are drunk, they are brutal, it's not our business, said his father. He put his arms around his father, but he felt choked. He tried to draw breath, to cry out, and woke up. He waked up, gasping for breath, his hair soaked with perspiration, and stood up in terror. Thank God that was only a dream, he said, sitting down under a tree and drawing deep breaths. But what is it? Is it some fever coming on? Such a hideous dream. He felt utterly broken. Darkness and confusion were in his soul. He rested his elbows on his knees and leaned his head on his hands. Good God, he cried. Can it be? Can it be that I shall really take an axe? That I shall strike her on the head, split her skull open? That I shall tread in the sticky warm blood, break the lock, steal and tremble, hide all spattered in blood? With the axe? Good God, can it be? He was shaking like a leaf as he said this. But why am I going on like this? He continued, sitting up again, as it were in profound amazement. I knew that I could never bring myself to do it, so what have I been torturing myself for till now? Yesterday when I went to make that experiment, yesterday I realized completely that I could never bear to do it. Why am I going over it again then? Why am I hesitating? As I came down the stairs yesterday, I said to myself that it was base, loathsome, vile. Vile, the very thought of it made me feel sick and filled me with horror. No, I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. Granted that there is no flaw in all that reasoning, that all that I have concluded this last month is clear as day, true as arithmetic. My God, anyway, I couldn't bring myself to do it. I couldn't do it. Why then am I still... He rose to his feet, looked round in wonder as though surprised at finding himself in this place, and went towards the bridge. He was pale, his eyes glowed, he was exhausted in every limb, but he seemed suddenly to breathe more easily. He felt he had cast off that fearful burden that had so long been weighing upon him, and all at once there was a sense of relief and peace in his soul. Lord, he prayed, show me my path. I renounce that accursed dream of mine. Crossing the bridge, he gazed quietly and calmly at the Neva, at the glowing red sun setting in the glowing sky. In spite of his weakness, he was not conscious of fatigue. It was as though, An abscess that had been forming for a month past in his heart had suddenly broken. Freedom. Freedom. He was free from that spell, that sorcery, that obsession. Later on, when he recalled that time and all that happened to him during those days, minute by minute, point by point, he was superstitiously impressed by one circumstance which, though in itself not very exceptional, always seemed to him afterwards the predestined turning point of his fate. He could never understand and explain to himself why, when he was tired and worn out, when it would have been more convenient for him to go home by the shortest and most direct way, he had returned by the Haymarket, where he had no need to go. It was obviously, and quite unnecessarily, out of his way, though not much so. It is true that it happened to him dozens of times to return home without noticing what streets he passed through. But why, he was asking himself, why had such an important, such a decisive, and at the same time such an absolutely chance meeting happened in the Haymarket, where he had, moreover, no reason to go, at the very hour, the very minute of his life, when he was just in the very mood and in the very circumstances in which that meeting was able to exert the gravest and most decisive influence on his whole destiny. As though it had been lying in wait for him on purpose. It was about 9 o'clock when he crossed the Haymarket. At the tables and the barrows, at the booths and at the shops, all the market people were closing their establishments or clearing away and packing up their wares and, like their customers, were going home. Rag pickers and costermongers of all kinds were crowding around the taverns in the dirty and stinking courtyards of the Haymarket. Raskolnikov particularly liked this place and the neighbouring alleys when he wandered aimlessly in the streets. Here his rags did not attract contemptuous attention, and one could walk about in any attire without scandalizing people. At the corner of an alley, a huckster and his wife had 2 tables set out with tapes, thread, cotton, handkerchiefs, etc. They too had got up to go home, but were lingering in conversation with a friend who had just come up to them. This friend was Lizaveta Ivanovna, or, as everyone called her, Lizaveta, the younger sister of the old pawnbroker, Alyona Ivanovna, whom Raskolnikov had visited the previous day to pawn his watch and make his experiment. He already knew all about Lizaveta, and she knew him a little too. She was a single woman of about 35, tall, clumsy, timid, submissive, and almost idiotic. She was a complete slave and went in fear and trembling of her sister, who made her work day and night, and even beat her. She was standing with a bundle before the huckster and his wife, listening earnestly and doubtfully. They were talking of something with special warmth. The moment Raskolnikov caught sight of her, he was overcome by a strange sensation, as it were of intense astonishment, though there was nothing astonishing about this meeting. "You can make up your mind for yourself, Lizaveta Ivanovna," the huckster was saying aloud. "Come round tomorrow at about 7. They will be here too." "Tomorrow," said Lizaveta slowly and thoughtfully, as though unable to make up her mind. "Upon my word, what a fright you are in of Alyona Ivanovna," gabbled the huckster's wife, a lively little woman. "I look at you, you're like some little babe, and she is not your own sister either. Nothing but a stepsister, and what a hand she keeps over you. But this time, don't say a word to Alyona Ivanovna," the husband interrupted. "That's my advice. But come round to us without asking, it will be worth your while. Later on, your sister herself may have a notion." "Am I to come?" "About 7 o'clock tomorrow, and they will be here. You will be able to decide for yourself." "And we'll have a cup of tea," added his wife. "All right, I'll come," said Lizaveta, still pondering, and she began slowly moving away. Raskolnikov had just passed, and heard no more. He passed softly, unnoticed, trying not to miss a word. His first amazement was followed by a thrill of horror, like a shiver running down his spine. He had suddenly, quite unexpectedly learnt, that the next day at 7 o'clock, Lizaveta, the old woman's sister and only companion, would be away from home, and that therefore at 7 o'clock, precisely, the old woman would be left alone. He was only a few steps from his lodging. He went in like a man condemned to death. He thought of nothing and was incapable of thinking. But he felt suddenly in his whole being that he had no more freedom of thought, no will, and that everything was suddenly and irrevocably decided. Certainly, if he had to wait whole years for a suitable opportunity, he could not reckon on a more certain step towards the success of the plan than that which had just presented itself. In any case, it would have been difficult to find out beforehand, and with certainty, with greater exactness and less risk, and without dangerous inquiries and investigations. That next day, at a certain time, an old woman, on whose life an attempt was contemplated, would be at home and entirely alone. Chapter 6. Later on, Raskolnikov happened to find out why the huckster and his wife had invited Lizaveta. It was a very ordinary matter, and there was nothing exceptional about it. A family who had come to town and been reduced to poverty were selling their household goods and clothes, all women's things. As the things would have fetched little in the market, they were looking for a dealer. This was Lizaveta's business. She undertook such jobs and was frequently employed, as she was very honest and always fixed a fair price and stuck to it. She spoke, as a rule, little, and, as we have said already, she was very submissive and timid. But Raskolnikov had become superstitious of late. The traces of superstition remained in him long after, and were almost ineradicable. And in all this, he was always afterwards disposed to seeing something strange and mysterious, as it were, the presence of some peculiar influences and coincidences. In the previous winter, a student he knew called Pukorev, who had left for Kharkov, had chanced in conversation to give him the address of Alyona Ivanovna, the old pawnbroker, in case he might want to pawn anything. For a long while he did not go to her, for he had lessons and managed to get along somehow. 6 weeks ago, he had remembered the address. He had 2 articles that could be pawned: his father's old silver watch and a little gold ring with 3 red stones, a present from his sister at parting. He decided to take the ring. When he found the old woman, he had felt an insurmountable repulsion for her at first glance, though he knew nothing special about her. He got 2 rubles from her and went into a miserable little tavern on his way home. He asked for tea, sat down and sank into deep thought. A strange idea was pecking at his brain like a chicken in the egg, and very, very much absorbed him. Almost beside him at the next table, there was sitting a student, whom he did not know and had never seen, and with him a young officer. They had played a game of billiards and began drinking tea. All at once, he heard the student mention to the officer the pawnbroker, Alyona Ivanovna, and give him her address. This of itself seemed strange to Raskolnikov. He had just come from her, and here at once he heard her name. Of course it was a chance, but he could not shake off a very extraordinary impression, and here someone seemed to be speaking expressly for him. The student began telling his friend various details about Alyona Ivanovna. "She is first-rate," he said. "You can always get money from her. She's as rich as a Jew. She can give you 5,000 rubles at a time, and she is not above taking a pledge for a ruble. Lots of our fellows have had dealings with her, but she is an awful old harpy." And he began describing how spiteful and uncertain she was, how if you were only a day late with your interest, the pledge was lost, how she gave a quarter of the value of an article and took 5 and even 7% a month on it, and so on. The student chatted on, saying that she had a sister, Lizaveta, whom the wretched little creature was continually beating, and kept in complete bondage like a small child, though Lizaveta was at least 6 feet high. "There's a phenomenon for you," cried the student, and he laughed. They began talking about Lizaveta. The student spoke about her with a peculiar relish and was continually laughing, and the officer listened with great interest and asked him to send Lizaveta to do some mending for him. Raskolnikov did not miss a word and learned everything. Lizaveta was younger than the old woman and was her half-sister, being the child of a different mother. She was 35. She worked day and night for her sister, and besides doing the cooking and the washing, she did sewing and worked as a charwoman and gave her sister all she earned. She did not dare accept an order or job of any kind without her sister's permission. The old woman had already made her will, and Lisaveta knew of it, and by this will she would not get a farthing, nothing but the movables, chairs, and so on. All the money was left to a monastery in the province of M, that prayers might be said for her in perpetuity. Lisaveta was of a lower rank than her sister, unmarried and awfully uncouth in appearance, remarkably tall with long feet that looked as if they were bent outwards. She always wore battered goatskin shoes and was clean in her person. What the student expressed most surprise and amusement about was the fact that Lisaveta was continually with child. "But you say she is hideous," observed the officer. "Yes, she is so dark-skinned and looks like a soldier dressed up, but, she is not at all hideous. She has such a good-natured face and eyes, strikingly so. And the proof of it is that lots of people are attracted by her. She is such a soft, gentle creature, ready to put up with anything, always willing to do anything. And her smile is really very sweet." "You seem to find her attractive yourself," laughed the officer. "From her queerness? No, I'll tell you what. I could kill that damned old woman and make off with her money, I assure you, without the faintest conscience prick," the student added with warmth. The officer laughed again while Raskolnikov shuddered. How strange it was. "Listen, I want to ask you a serious question," the student said hotly. "I was joking, of course, but look here. On one side, we have a stupid, senseless, worthless, spiteful, ailing, horrid old woman, not simply useless, but doing actual mischief, who has not an idea what she is living for herself, and who will die in a day or two in any case. You understand?" "You understand?" Yes, I understand," answered the officer, watching his excited companion attentively. "Well, listen then. On the other side, fresh young lives thrown away for want of help and by thousands on every side. 100,000 good deeds could be done and helped on that old woman's money, which will be buried in a monastery. Hundreds, thousands perhaps, might be set on the right path. Dozens of families saved from destitution, from ruin, from vice, from the lock hospitals. And all with her money. Kill her, take her money, and with that help of it, devote oneself to the service of humanity and the good of all. What do you think? Would not one tiny crime be wiped out by thousands of good deeds in decay? One death and 100 lives in exchange. It's simple arithmetic. Besides, what value has the life of that sickly, stupid, ill-natured old woman in the balance of existence? No more than the life of a louse, of a black beetle, less, in fact, because that old woman is doing harm. She is wearing out the lives of others. The other day she bit Lisaveta's finger out of spite. It almost had to be amputated. Of course, she does not deserve to live, remarked the officer. But there it is, it's nature. Oh well, brother, but we have to correct and direct nature. And but for that, we should drown in an ocean of prejudice. But for that, there would never have been a single great man. They talk of duty, conscience. I don't want to say anything against duty and conscience, but the point is, what do we mean by them? Stay, I have another question to ask you. Listen. No, you stay. I'll ask you a question. Listen. Well? You are talking and speechifying away, but tell me, would you kill the old woman yourself? Of course not. I was only arguing the justice of it. It's nothing to do with me. But I think, if you would not do it yourself, there's no justice about it. Let us have another game. Raskolnikov was violently agitated. Of course, it was all ordinary youthful talk and thought, such as he had often heard before in different forms and on different themes. But why had he happened to hear such a discussion and such ideas at the very moment when his own brain was just conceiving the very same ideas? And why, just at the moment when he had brought away the embryo of his idea from the old woman, had he dropped at once upon a conversation about her? This coincidence always seemed strange to him. This trivial talk in the tavern had an immense influence on him in his later action, as though there really had been in it something preordained, some guiding hint. On returning from the Haymarket, he flung himself on the sofa and sat for a whole hour without stirring. Meanwhile it got dark. He had no candle, and indeed, it did not occur to him to light up. He can never recollect whether he had been thinking about anything at that time. At last, he was conscious of his former fever and shivering, and he realised with relief that he could lie down on the sofa. Soon heavy, leaden sleep came over him as it were crushing him. He slept an extraordinarily long time, and without dreaming. Nastasia, coming into his room at 10 o'clock the next morning, had difficulty in rousing him. She brought him in tea and bread. The tea was again the second brew, and again in her own teapot.
"My goodness, how he sleeps,"
she cried indignantly.
"And he is always asleep."
He got up with an effort. His head ached. He stood up, took a turn in his garret, and sank back on the sofa again.
"Going to sleep again?"
cried Nastasia.
"Are you ill, eh?"
He made no reply.
"Do you want some tea?"
"Afterwards," he said with an effort, closing his eyes again and turning to the wall. Nastasia stood over him.
"Perhaps he really is ill,"
she said, turned and went out. She came in again at 2 o'clock with soup. He was lying as before. The tea stood untouched. Nastasia felt positively offended and began wrathfully rousing him.
"Why are you lying like a log?"
she shouted, looking at him with repulsion. He got up and sat down again, but said nothing and stared at the floor.
"Are you ill or not?"
asked Nastasia, and again received no answer.
"You'd better get out and get a breath of air,"
she said after a pause.
"Will you eat it or not?"
"Afterwards," he said weakly. "You can go." And he motioned her out. She remained a little longer, looked at him with compassion, and went out. A few minutes afterwards, he raised his eyes and looked for a long while at the tea and the soup. Then he took the bread, took up a spoon, and began to eat. He ate a little, 3 or 4 spoonfuls, without appetite, as it were mechanically. His head ached less. After his meal, he stretched himself on the sofa again, but now he could not sleep. He lay without stirring, with his face in the pillow. He was haunted by daydreams, and such strange daydreams. In one that kept recurring, he fancied that he was in Africa, in Egypt, in some sort of oasis. The caravan was resting, the camels were peacefully lying down, the palms stood all around in complete circle. All the party were at dinner, but he was drinking water from a spring which flowed gurgling close by. And it was so cool. It was wonderful. Wonderful blue, cold water running among the party-coloured stones and over the clean sand. Sud roused himself, raised his head, looked out of the window, and seeing how late it was, suddenly jumped up wide awake, as though someone had pulled him off the sofa. He crept on tiptoe to the door, stealthily opened it, and began listening on the staircase. His heart beat terribly. But all was quiet on the stairs, as if everyone was asleep. It seemed to him strange and monstrous that he could have slept in such forgetfulness from the previous day and had done nothing, had prepared nothing yet. And meanwhile, perhaps it had struck 6. And his drowsiness and stupefaction were followed by an extraordinary, feverish, as it were, distracted haste. But the preparations to be made were few. He concentrated all his energies on thinking of everything and forgetting nothing, and his heart kept beating and thumping so that he could hardly breathe. First, he had to make a noose and sew it into his overcoat, a work of a moment. He rummaged under his pillow and picked out, amongst the linen stuffed away under it, a worn-out, old, unwashed shirt. From its rags he tore a long strip, a couple of inches wide and about 16 inches long. He folded the strip in 2, took off his wide, strong summer overcoat from some stout cotton material, his only outer garment, and began sewing the 2 ends of the rag on the inside under the left armhole. His hands shook as he sewed, but he did it successfully, so that nothing showed outside when he put the coat on again. The needle and thread he had got ready long before, and they lay on his table in a piece of paper. As for the noose, it was a very ingenious device of his own. The noose was intended for the axe. It was impossible for him to carry the axe through the street in his hands, and if hidden under his coat, he would still have had to support it with his hand, which would have been noticeable. Now, he had only to put the head of the axe in the noose, and it would hang quietly under his arm on the inside. Putting his hand in his coat pocket, he could hold the end of the handle all the way so that it did not swing, and as the coat was very full, a regular sack in fact, it could not be seen from outside that he was holding something with the hand that was in the pocket. This noose, too, he had designed a fortnight before. When he had finished with this, he thrust his hand into a little opening between his sofa and the floor, fumbled in the left corner, and drew out the pledge, which he had got ready long before and hidden there. This pledge was, however, only a smoothly planed piece of wood, the size and thickness of a silver cigarette case. He picked up this piece of wood in one of his wanderings in a courtyard where there was some sort of workshop. Afterwards, he had added to the wood a thin, smooth piece of iron, which he had also picked up at the same time in the street. Putting the iron, which was a little the smaller, on the piece of wood, he fastened them very firmly, crossing and recrossing the thread round them, then wrapped them carefully and daintily in clean white paper and tied up the parcel so that it would be very difficult to untie it. This was in order to divert the attention of the old woman for a time, while she was trying to undo the knot, and so to gain a moment. The iron strip was added to give weight, so that the woman might not guess the first minute that the thing was made of wood. All this had been stored by him beforehand under the sofa. He had only just got the pledge out when he heard someone suddenly about in the yard. "It struck 6 long ago!" Long ago? My God! He rushed to the door, listened, caught up his hat, and began to descend his 13 steps cautiously, noiselessly, like a cat. He had still the most important thing to do: to steal the axe from the kitchen. That the deed must be done with an axe, he had decided long ago. He had also a pocket pruning knife, but he could not rely on the knife, and still less on his own strength, and so resolved finally on the axe. We may note in passing one peculiarity in regard to all the final resolutions taken by him in the matter. They had one strange characteristic. The more final they were, the more hideous and the more absurd they at once became in his eyes. In spite of all his agonizing inward struggle, he never for a single instant, in all that time, could believe in the carrying out of his plans. And, indeed, if it had ever happened that everything to the least point could have been considered and finally settled, and no uncertainty of any kind had remained, he would, it seems, have renounced it all as something absurd, monstrous, and impossible. But a whole mass of unsettled points and uncertainties remained. As for getting the axe, that trifling business cost him no anxiety, for nothing could be easier. Nastasia was continually out of the house, especially in the evenings. She would run into the neighbours or to a shop, and always left the door ajar. It was the one thing the landlady was always scolding her about. And so, when the time came, he would only have to go quietly into the kitchen and to take the axe, and an hour later, when everything was over, go in and put it back again. But these were doubtful points. Supposing he returned an hour later to put it back, and Nastasia had come back and was on the spot, he would of course had to go by and wait till she went out again. But supposing she were in the meantime to miss the axe, look for it, make an outcry, that would mean suspicion, or at least grounds for suspicion. But those were all trifles which he had not even begun to consider, and indeed had no time. He was thinking of the chief point, and put off trifling details until he could believe in it all. But that seemed utterly unattainable. So it seemed to himself, at least. He could not imagine for an instant that he would sometime leave off thinking, get up and simply go there. Even his late experiment, i.e. his visit with the object of a final survey of the place, was simply an attempt at an experiment, far from being the real thing, as though one should say, "Come, let us go and try it. Why dream about it?" And at once, he had broken down and had run away cursing in a frenzy with himself. Meanwhile, it would seem, as regards the moral question, that his analysis was complete. His casuistry had become keen as a razor, and he could not find rational objections in himself. But in the last resort, he simply ceased to believe in himself. and doggedly, slavishly sought arguments in all directions, fumbling for them, as though someone were forcing and drawing him to it. At first, long before indeed, he had been much occupied with one question: why almost all crimes are so badly concealed and so easily detected, and why almost all criminals leave such obvious traces. He had come gradually to many different and curious conclusions, and in his opinion, the chief reason lay not so much in the material impossibility of concealing the crime, as in the criminal himself. Almost every criminal is subject to a failure of will and reasoning power by a childish and phenomenal heedlessness. At the very prudence and caution are most essential. It was his conviction that this eclipse of reason and failure of willpower attacked a man like a disease, developed gradually and reached its highest point just before the perpetration of the crime, continued with equal violence at the moment of the crime and for a longer or shorter time after, according to the individual case, and then passed off like any other disease. The question, whether this disease gives rise to the crime, or whether the crime from its own peculiar nature is always accompanied by something of the nature of disease, he did not yet feel able to decide. When he reached these conclusions, he decided in his own case there could not be such a morbid reaction, that his reason and will would remain unimpaired at the time of carrying out his design, for the simple reason that his design was not a crime. We will omit all the process by means of which he arrived at this last conclusion. We have run too far ahead already. We may add only that the practical, purely material difficulties of the affair occupied a secondary position in his mind. One has but to keep all one's willpower and reason to deal with them, and they will all be overcome at the time when once one has familiarized oneself with the minutest details of the business. But this preparation had never been begun. His final decisions were what he came to trust least, and when the hour struck, it all came to pass quite differently, as it were accidentally and unexpectedly. One trifling circumstance upset his calculations before he had even left the staircase. When he reached the landlady's kitchen, the door of which was open as usual, he glanced cautiously in to see whether in Nastasia's absence the landlady herself was there, or if not, whether the door to her own room was closed so that she might not peep out when he went in for the axe. But what was his amazement when he suddenly saw that Nastasia was not only at home in the kitchen, but was occupied there, taking linen out of a basket and hanging it on a line. Seeing him, she left off hanging the clothes, turned to him, and stared at him all the time he was passing. He turned away his eyes and walked past as though he noticed nothing. But it was the end of everything. He had not the axe. He was overwhelmed. What made me think? He reflected as he went under the gateway. What made me think that she would be sure not to be at home at that moment? Why? Why did I assume this so certainly? He was crushed and even humiliated. He could have laughed at himself in his anger. A dull animal rage boiled within him. He stood hesitating in the gateway. To go into the street, to go for a walk for appearance sake, was revolting. To go back to his room, even more revolting. What a chance I have lost forever, he muttered, standing aimlessly in the gateway just opposite the porter's little dark room, which was also open. Suddenly he started. From the porter's room, 2 paces away from him, something shining under the bench to the right caught his eye. He looked about him. Nobody. He approached the room on tiptoe, went down 2 steps into it, and in a faint voice called the porter. Yes, not at home. Somewhere near, though, in the yard, for the door is wide open. He dashed to the axe, it was an axe, and pulled it out from under the bench, where it lay between 2 chunks of wood. At once, before going out, he made it fast in the noose. He thrust both hands into his pockets and went out of the room. No one had noticed him. Devil helps, he thought with a strange grin. This chance raised his spirits extraordinarily. He walked along quietly and sedately, without hurry, to avoid awakening suspicion. He scarcely looked at the passers-by, tried to escape looking at their faces at all, and to be as little noticeable as possible. Suddenly, he thought of his hat. Good heavens. I had the money the day before yesterday and did not get a cap to wear instead. A curse rose from the bottom of his soul. Glancing out of the corner of his eye into a shop, he saw by a clock on the wall that it was 10 minutes past 7. He had to make haste, and at the same time to go some way round so as to approach the house from the other side. When he happened to imagine all this beforehand, he had sometimes thought that he would be very much afraid. But he was not very much afraid now. Was not afraid at all, indeed. His mind was even occupied by irrelevant matters, but by nothing for long. As he passed the Yusupov garden, he was deeply absorbed in considering the building of great fountains, and of their refreshing effect on the atmosphere in all the squares. By degrees he passed to the conviction that if the summer garden were extended to the field of Mars, and perhaps joined to the garden of the Mikhailovsky Palace, it would be a splendid thing and a great benefit to the town. Then he was interested by the question why in all great towns men are not simply driven by necessity, but in some peculiar way inclined to live in those parts of the town where there are no gardens nor fountains, where there is most dirt and smell and all sorts of nastiness. Then his own walks through the Haymarket came back to his mind, and for a moment he waked up to reality. What nonsense, he thought. Better think of nothing at all. So probably men led to execution clutch mentally at every object that meets them on the way. Flashed through his mind, but simply flashed, like lightning. He made haste to dismiss this thought. And by now, he was near. Here was the house. Here was the gate. Suddenly, a clock somewhere struck once. What? Can it be 7:30? Impossible, it must be fast. Luckily for him, everything went well again at the gates. At that very moment, as though expressly for his benefit, a huge wagon of hay had just driven in at the gate, completely screening him as he passed under the gateway, and the wagon had scarcely had time to drive through into the yard before he had slipped in a flash to the right. On the other side of the wagon, he could hear shouting and quarrelling, but no one noticed him, and no one met him. Many windows looking into that huge quadrangular yard were open at that moment, but he did not raise his head. He had not the strength to. The staircase leading to the old woman's room was close by, just on the right of the gateway. He was already on the stairs. Drawing a breath, pressing his hand against his throbbing heart, and once more feeling for the axe and setting it straight, he began softly and cautiously ascending the stairs, listening every minute. But the stairs, too, were quite deserted. All the doors were shut. He met no one. One flat, indeed, on the first floor, was wide open, and painters were at work in it, but they did not glance at him. He stood still, thought a minute, and went on. Of course, it would be better if they had not been here, but it's 2 stories above them. And there was the 4th story. Here was the door. Here was the flat opposite, the empty one. The flat underneath the old woman's was apparently empty also. The visiting card nailed on the door had been torn off. They had gone away. He was out of breath. For one instant, the thought floated through his mind. Shall I go back? But he made no answer and began listening at the old woman's door. A dead silence. Then he listened again on the staircase, listened long and intently, then looked about him for the last time, pulled himself together, drew himself up, and once more tried the axe and the noose. Am I very pale? He wondered. Am I not evidently agitated? She is mistrustful. Had I better wait a little longer, till my heart leaves off thumping? But his heart did not leave off. On the contrary, as though to spite him, it throbbed more and more violently. He could stand it no longer. He slowly put out his hand to the bell and rang. Half a minute later, he rang again, more loudly. No answer. To go on ringing was useless and out of place. The old woman was of course at home, but she was suspicious and alone. He had some knowledge of her habits, and once more he put his ear to the door. Either his senses were peculiarly keen, which it is difficult to suppose, or the sound was really very distinct. Anyway, he suddenly heard something like the cautious touch of a hand on the lock and the rustle of a skirt at the very door. Someone was standing stealthily close to the lock, and just as he was doing on the outside, was secretly listening within, and seemed to have her ear to the door. He moved a little on purpose, and muttered something aloud that he might not have the appearance of hiding, then rang a third time, but quietly, soberly, and without impatience. Recalling it afterwards, that moment stood out in his mind vividly, distinctly forever. He could not make out how he had had such cunning, for his mind was, as it were, clouded at moments, and he was almost unconscious of his body. An instant later, he heard the latch unfastened. Chapter 7. The door was as before opened a tiny crack, and again 2 sharp and suspicious eyes stared at him out of the darkness. Then Raskolnikov lost his head